My name is Erin Heath. I work here at AAAS as Associate Director of Government Relations. I want to say because I work here, I've seen how much planning and effort goes into this conference, and it's really incredible to see it come together. So if you see Maureen or Say or Nicole, and you haven't done this yet, give them a big pat on the back because this has been incredible. I'm very excited for this panel. This is improving our future education and research culture to strengthen science. And we have 4 stellar speakers. We'll start out with Alan Leshner. He is CEO Emeritus of AAAS. So many of you know him. We'll then turn to Fraser Benya. She's a Senior Program Officer with the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Then we'll have Gilda Barbino, the Daniel and Francis Berg Professor and Dean of the Grove School of Engineering at the City College of New York. And finally, we'll have Kate Stoll, Senior Policy Advisor at the MIT Washington office. They will each give their presentations one-on-one, and then we'll do Q&A. So Alan, why don't you come up to the stage, and I will pull up your slides. Here we go. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. No. Those of you who know me know that is not an acceptable greeting. We're between, you and lunch. Let's get a little more enthusiasm and warmth. Good morning. Good morning. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much. This is an interesting topic because culture change within the scientific community has been incredibly slow coming, and everybody knows that culture change in academia is extremely difficult. One of the most remarkable instances of culture change occurred over the weekend when the National Academy of Sciences, with a very large margin, voted to approve a policy that it would allow people to be basically ejected for violating what ought to have been accepted norms for the 150 years that the institution existed. So it's really a sign, I think, it's a landmark that the culture change will happen. It's sort of indicative of how long it takes for it. So the topic I'm going to talk about is yet another one that has, in fact, taken a very long time to get interest and change, and that is a change in the way we view and the way in which we approach graduate education in science. So the issue is very simple. Graduate education is lagging behind the evolution of science and engineering as enterprises, the nature of the workforce, and importantly, the career goals and paths of the students. The world of science has changed. You know that well. Science has become much more multidisciplinary. The most interesting questions in science, I would argue, all lie at the interface among disciplines. In fact, I once wrote an editorial in Science with the theme, The Demise of Disciplinary Science. You can hate me later for that. The workforce is becoming more diverse. And of course, importantly in this case, over 60% of new PhDs don't go into academic research, but we train them the same way we've trained them for the past 100 years. I just said that. I love this. I did not make this, but I need you to admire it. Do you see that? When I was at NIH years ago, one of my special assistants made that. But it really does make the point that there is a disconnect that exists between the needs and aspirations of today's graduate students and the way in which we've conceptualized it. So in response to that issue, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine created this committee on revitalizing graduate STEM education for the 21st century. I actually don't love the title revitalizing because one of the things that's both good and bad is that the American graduate education system has served us incredibly well over those same 100 years and continues to serve us fundamentally well, but it needs to evolve, as do all things need to evolve. I didn't bring a list to the committee, but it was a fabulous committee. Kate Stoll was on it. Wave your hand. Keith Yamamoto, who was here earlier. And in fact, it was an incredibly diverse committee in every dimension in the word, including seniority in science, so that in addition to people who look like me, there were a bunch of younger, more recent graduates, and I will say that they, in fact, contributed most of the important insights. That's the report, came out just a year ago. The study director, who's fabulous, named Lane Scherer, bother her. Okay, so I won't go through all the changes that need to occur, but I do want to say that none of them are going to happen unless there is a significant culture change in the way we see academia. We need actually two categories of change or evolution. One is to move from a faculty-focused enterprise, or one based solely around research productivity, to one that focuses much more on students and their needs. We call it has to become more student-centric. The second, and we can talk about the details of that later, and the second is that stigma that has long surrounded anybody whose interest was going into anything other than academic research, that stigma has to be confronted. I can tell you that I started out as an academic researcher, and when after I would say a moderately successful scientific career early, I told my mentor that I was leaving, that I was going to give up a tenured full professorship and become a Fed. And he ripped his clothes, poured ashes on his head, went into mourning, said both of us were obviously failures. He had failed, and I, of course, had failed. I will say 10 years later, he had my picture on his door. But the stigma was very dramatic, and students all over the country report that persists. So our report focused on what everybody should do. Well, those of you who know me won't be surprised that we tell everybody what to do. But the recommendations are, first of all, to improve the quality of teaching and mentoring, and we have a variety of ways of doing that. But the cultural issues are, first of all, to train mentors and advisors. Interestingly, I was in a university yesterday talking to a bunch of young faculty about the need to evolve graduate education, and they, 201, loved the idea of getting that kind of training. The biggest cultural change really is to rebalance, not to shift promotion and tenure criteria, but in fact, to bring up the value attributed to mentoring, advising, and give it more credence. Otherwise, nothing will change. So long as promotion and tenure is based primarily or solely on the basis of number of papers in Science, Nature, or Cell, you'll notice science was first, or the number of grants received, if that's all that matters, that's what people will respond to. So, train mentors, rebalance promotion. We have got to face the issues of diversity. We have to create equitable and inclusive environments. And then we ought to provide ways to explore a variety of careers. That's not vocational education. That means that if a student wants to go get an experience in industry for a couple of months, the PI has to have a way to allow that to happen. The only way the academic culture will change, I believe, is if we can make changes in the funding system that drives culture in academia, and that is to bring up the importance, to elevate the importance of quality in teaching and mentoring if somebody is supporting students. So training grants seems obvious, that is not universally required. And I believe, and I'm speaking I because not everyone on the committee may agree with this particular point, I think that federal agencies ought to have a policy that says if you get a research assistant on your grant, you have to demonstrate that you're providing quality mentoring. How you do that, I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but that's workable, that's doable. But you've got to change the value system. Okay, you can read the rest of it. Some things are happening, and they're really good, both before and after our study. Many individual institutions are doing great things. Many are not doing anything. We need them all to be doing things. Council of Graduate Schools has taken this up in a major way. AAU has taken this up in a truly major way. NIH has some activities. NSF has done some stuff. I'm trying to be aware of the time. Johns Hopkins just announced about a month ago a new initiative that will, in a focused way, commit $1.5 million to a bunch of initiatives to do exactly the kinds of stuff that we're talking about. This is the AAU initiative that I alluded to, and it's got virtually every one of the AAU universities committed. So there is movement. The question is, can we keep the movement moving, and can we keep the culture moving? None of it will happen, none of the needs will be met unless we make graduate education student-centric, refocus the outcome goals. I would actually say focus them, as opposed to just leave them in this sort of distributed way. We can talk about this later too, but under Keith's prodding, our committee came up with a set of core competencies that ought to be in every education, which I think would be very useful. You can read as well as I, reduce the stigma, reward high quality stuff, and provide a real commitment to providing a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. None of that will happen without the shift in academic culture, which will happen because of rebalancing the incentives. And I think within academia, we've got to train the mentors. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. We're now going to welcome up Fraser Benya. She's going to be talking about changing the culture and climate to prevent sexual harassment.
So I'll go ahead and start while they're pulling things up. So while Alan was the chair of the committee, I was the study director for this academy's study. So that means that I'm going to present the views of all of the committee members, which include Dr. Gilda Berabino. I'm going to give you the really high-level overview of what is a 300-page report. So I won't be able to go into a lot of the details on the data, but we'll get the key messages out there. All right, so the key findings here, if you didn't already know, there is extensive sexual harassment in these environments. The committee found that for women faculty members and staff in academia, about 50% of them will experience sexual harassment in this environment. And the data comes from surveys that ask these women about their experiences in a 1 to 2 year period of time, not over their whole career. When it comes to student data, there's a range between 20 to 50% of women students in science, engineering, and medicine will face specific sexual harassment at the hands of faculty and staff members. The next key finding from this report is that gender harassment is the most common form of sexual harassment. I'm going to go into a little more detail on what we mean by that in the next slide. The third was that sexual harassment undermines research integrity, reduces the talent pool, and harms targets and bystanders. The fourth is that unfortunately the legal system that we have in place in this country, while necessary, is in no way sufficient to address or prevent or reduce sexual harassment. It is built on a legal compliance-based system that just requires that policies, procedures be in place and that the community be informed of them and that they use them, but not that any of those things in any way be effective. Fortunately, the committee found that changing the climate and the culture, and there is a distinction between those two that I'll explain, can actually prevent and effectively address sexual harassment. So I'm going to start where the committee started, which is, what do we mean when we talk about sexual harassment? The committee reviewed social science and legal scholarship and found that sexual harassment is a form of discrimination that consists of 3 types of behavior: sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attention, and gender harassment. To help convey these 3 types of sexual harassment and how they look and the level of public awareness around them, they've overlaid the examples of these types of sexual harassment onto this iceberg image. What this conveys is that the waterline is the level of public consciousness or public awareness around the term sexual harassment. So what's above it is what we often think of as a society is sexual harassment. What is below it is what we often do not think of as sexual harassment. So at the top of the iceberg, most readily recognizable in the eyes of the public and most readily recognizable in policies and practices is attention to the type of sexual harassment known as sexual coercion. This refers to implicit or explicit attempts to make conditions of employment or education contingent upon sexual cooperation. This is the prototypical sleep with me or you're fired situation. It is often the first thing that comes to people's mind when they think of the term sexual harassment, but it is also the rarest form. Just above and below the waterline, you'll find the form of sexual harassment known as unwanted sexual attention. This refers to sexual advances that are unwelcome, unreciprocated, and unpleasant to the target. Included here are things like unwanted touching, hugging, stroking, kissing, and relentless pressure for dates despite discouragement. This form of sexual harassment can, and sometimes does, include sexual assault. In other words, the same behavior can be both a civil rights violation and a crime. All of that said, most of the time, sexual harassment takes the form of a put down. It does not have the appearance of being a come on like the first 2 types I described do. The most common form of sexual harassment, as I said at the beginning, is gender harassment. And this refers to verbal and visual conduct that conveys hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of one gender. These are comments like women aren't cut out to be surgeons, or girls don't belong in engineering, or mothers can't do field research. Gender harassment also refers to degrading images and words in the ambient environment. Now, as I mentioned, the gender harassing conduct in this image is submerged underwater. And that is because, as with icebergs, what's underwater is crucially important and rather dangerous. It might be tempting to assume a continuum of severity within these behaviors, that, for instance, what's at the top of the iceberg is somehow worse than what's at the bottom of the iceberg. But the committee reviewed the evidence for this assumption and found that it does not hold up to scientific scrutiny. What they found is that even when sexual harassment entails nothing but gender harassment, it takes a toll on victims. In fact, severe or pervasive gender harassment does the same professional and psychological damage as an isolated instance of sexual coercion. It's as a result of this research that the committee recommended that leaders in academic institutions and research and training sites pay increased attention to and enact policies that cover gender harassment as a means of addressing the most common form of sexual harassment and of preventing the other types of sexually harassing behavior. And the reason for that last part is that whenever the vast majority of the time a woman experiences the other 2 types of sexual harassment, it is almost always in the presence of gender harassment. You may also wonder what the impacts of this sexual harassment look like. The committee found that sexual harassment undermines, as I said, women's professional and educational attainment and their mental and physical health. When it comes to mental and physical health, the more often women are harassed, the more they report symptoms of depression, disordered eating, stress, anxiety, and physical complaints like headaches, exhaustion, and sleep disruption. This can also include developing symptoms that meet the clinical criteria for major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress. For the professional and educational aspects, dozens of studies have made clear that sexual harassment derails women's work lives. When women are sexually harassed, they will find their jobs less satisfying and more stressful. Many will engage in some form of work withdrawal, meaning they remain at their institutions but disengage from the work. They begin showing up late to work. They opt out of opportunities at work. They generally become less interested in contributing to the institution. Others will simply leave, sometimes to take positions at other institutions, but other times to leave their field entirely. All of this is done in an effort to escape the abusive situation. When it comes to bystanders, the committee found that one need not be directly targeted with sexual harassment to feel its effects. The research shows that people who merely see sexual harassment targeted at others in the same environment will report negative outcomes that parallel those of direct targets. So the question then becomes, since we now know that the legal system does not sufficiently address sexual harassment, the committee went back to the research to figure out what are the factors that are most significant in predicting sexual harassment, and how could those be used to prevent it. So there are two main characteristics that will predict high rates of sexual harassment in an environment, and they are organizational factors, not individual factors. The first is whether or not our environment is male-dominated, and this can be created in terms of overall numbers in an environment. So the example here would be from engineering, where at every level in engineering, from the undergraduate, graduate, faculty, and in industry, it is a male-dominated field. You can also create the male-dominated environment if just the leadership is male-dominated. So in this instance, we look to medicine. At the medical school environment for the last couple of years, the medical students have been at gender parity. However, the leadership in medicine remains heavily male-dominated. The third way is if culturally it is seen as abnormal for women to do the work. So we might say, for instance, that culturally in our society, we think it's abnormal for a woman to work on an oil rig, and that alone would create the male-dominated environment. The second characteristic that creates high risk for sexual harassment is an organizational tolerance for sexual harassment. This is often what's referred to as an organizational climate. And the researchers identify three characteristics that will create this organizational tolerance. First is if the community perceives that reporting is risky. The second is if the community perceives that reports are not taken seriously when they come forward. And the third is if the community perceives that offenders escape sanctions. Now, I emphasized the community perceives for every one of these because this is what helps to explain the difference between organizational climate and organizational culture. The culture in our organizations are the values and mission statements, the things we say we ascribe to. We write them in gold on walls, we put them on our about pages, we ascribe to these things. The climate in an organization is how your community feels those values are lived and experienced on a day-to-day basis. So for academics, to emphasize the difference between these two and grasp the concept, I always tell them that in academia, we say that our culture values equally research, service, and teaching, right? But everyone's chuckling because we all know that the climate conveys that we value research above the other two. And that is what is happening with sexual harassment. We have policies and procedures in place that say we do not tolerate sexual harassment, but the reality is that the climate conveys just the opposite. It is important to note that this organizational climate is by far the greatest predictor of sexual harassment. And so as a result of this research that the committee made a series of recommendations that aim to change the organizational climate in higher education. I'm going to show you a brief video to introduce you to these recommendations since we don't have a lot of time.
As a country, we have woken up to the ways women's lives are impacted by sexual harassment. The time has come to focus on academic institutions, especially in male-dominated fields like science, engineering, and medicine. Together, we can do better by creating a climate that discourages all forms of sexual harassment, including sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attention, and gender harassment. Research shows that we must do more than attend occasional training sessions and review vague policies and procedures. Here is what we need to do. 1. Integrate values into the system. Policies and procedures must embody the institutional values of diversity, inclusion, and respect, especially for hiring, promotion, and tenure decision-making. 2. Change the power dynamics. With funding, research focus, and professional reputation wrapped up in a single advisor-trainee relationship, the potential for abuse is too high. Institutions need to diffuse these dependencies by encouraging advisor networks and provide independent funding so students and trainees have options. 3. Support targets of sexual harassment. Many women don't report sexual harassment because they fear it will hurt them in their careers, and it does. Institutions must do more to support targets by providing alternative ways to access support services, record information about an incident, and report an incident without fear of retaliation. 4. Improve transparency and accountability. While still respecting people's privacy, institutions need to make their communities aware of the consequences sexual harassers will face and demonstrate that the institution investigates incidents and holds people accountable. Now is the time for institutions to take action. We can prevent sexual harassment.
Okay, so I'm going to show you those recommendations in a little more detail because that was very high level. The video spoke about hiring and promotion aspects, and that's about getting our culture into our actual policies and procedures. Civility promotion here is important because the research shows that high rates of incivility in an environment are tied to high rates of gender harassment. The other piece here is that the committee recommended making use of bystander intervention as a way to interrupt and intervene when inappropriate behavior occurs, so that in the moment we do not appear as if we're tolerating sexual harassment. This, of course, is not a new recommendation. There have been reports in the academies and elsewhere that have made such a recommendation about the problematic relationship between advisors and trainees. And these suggestions for how to go about doing them are not necessarily novel either. In this case, the committee made this recommendation because when the power differential between two parties is high, the impacts of sexual harassment are that much worse. Providing support for targets here, it's about giving access to these support services without requirements of formal report. It's also about alternative options other than a formal investigation process for victims, to give them options. And then this third bullet point is really a call for creative thinking and attention to the issue of retaliation. Most institutions inside and outside academia have relied on the fact that retaliation is illegal, told people that, and waited until it happened. And so if institutions are going to take this seriously, then the first thing we need to do is begin to think about the ways in which someone can be retaliated against in an academic environment, in academic career tracks, and then work to insulate them from those. The fourth part about improving transparency and accountability here, the committee points to clear policies that explain the behavior in ways that are not in legalistic words, but understandable to the community, and also that they make clear that there are disciplinary actions that people will be held to if they violate the policy. There are many policies out there in which no disciplinary consequences are listed at all. And that, of course, immediately signals that no one's prepared to actually enforce it. The committee also explicitly called for a set of escalating disciplinary consequences to be used so that behavior can be corrected before it even raises to the level of being illegal sexual harassment. When it comes to transparency, the committee pointed to the use by some institutions of creating statistical annual reports that convey information about how many informal, formal reports come forward, how long the investigations take, how often they result in findings of responsibility versus findings of non-responsibility, which I'll note is different than a false accusation. And then these reports also list sort of the statistical information on the types of disciplinary actions that are given out. The last point here is a call for using rigorous, well-validated climate surveys to talk about how big of a problem this is on your campus and to not rely on the rate of formal reports as a measure of that. Given this audience, I've also included here briefly some of the recommendations for policymakers that you again will see tie back to this organizational climate that we have to change. Better protection for sexual harassment claimants from retaliation, prohibiting confidentiality agreements and settlements, especially or particularly those that conceal the past adjudications for perpetrators, banning mandatory arbitration clauses, allowing lawsuits to be filed against alleged harassers directly instead of just or in addition to their academic employers. And then requiring institutions receiving federal funds to publicly disclose results of campus climate surveys and or the number of sexual harassment reports made to a campus. This last one is to request further study, and that is because there are many places in this research where there's more work that needs to be done, and we need to figure out how the progress that gets made in implementing some of these recommendations actually affects the organizational climate. These are recommendations based on the research we have at this point, but we do not have enough evidence to say this is a best practice. We have promising practices at this point. Lastly, I'll just acknowledge the sponsors for this study and the outreach efforts that we've done over the last year. The National Science Foundation was the lead sponsor, and they were joined by a number of federal agencies and private foundations. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now welcome Gilda to the stage. She's going to examine the culture of science through an intersectional lens.
So I would like to address the topic of the culture of science, which is complicated and multifaceted. So I would like to apply an intersectional lens to do so. For the outline, what I'd like to do is first describe the culture of science, apply that intersectional lens, and then after that, including the intersectional lens, think about how we could look at change. So the culture of science, we really need a deeper understanding of the science culture in order to transform it so they can be more inclusive and supporting of the success of women and members of underrepresented and underserved groups. First and foremost, we must understand that the culture of science and view science as it's socially constructed. It is both social and organizational, and it's a social process. There's a system of communication, interaction, and exchange. We must also understand how social factors influence who participates and who has status in science. Fraser just gave you an example and a description of climate and culture. It's depicted here in the model with roots to a tree. But let me just say a little bit more about this system. We know we have deeply held beliefs in reflecting the foundations of an organization, and the climate are those observable behaviors and habits. Unfortunately, the exclusion and marginalization of women and minorities have persisted in science and have been ingrained into organizational culture. Organizational cultures that hinder an individual's or specific group's needs for professional acceptance and belonging contribute to a chilly climate that can be ripe for gender and racial discrimination and for sexual harassment. In this model, we should also consider that in male-dominated fields, there's a preponderance of gender-restrictive conceptions of alpha male behavior. These conceptions include the promotion of competition over collaboration, separation rather than integration into one's group, and measuring the success of the individual rather than the group level. So following, again, this tree analogy with roots, to illustrate factors that influence the culture of science, And a report, Tectonic Movements, How Cultural Shifts Can Lift Up Women in Science. They list science culture as including things like closed hiring and promotion systems, keen competition, long training, and linear pathways. Structurally, items such as gendered organizational norms, hierarchical structure, funding, and relationships to power. And at a societal level, thinking about items such as stereotype threat, unconscious bias, harassment, gendered expectations, and outcomes. And all of this contributes to an ecosystem that does not necessarily support the career advancement and success of women and those from underrepresented groups. So some aspects identified with culture of science in this male-dominated environment have been described by a Stanford group as the masculinity contest culture. And in this description, they note things like the dominance of competition that's won by showing more masculine characteristics, the predominance of masculinity norms, a sexist climate, male-dominated leadership. So the lack of female leaders makes a difference. Again, we mentioned a climate that's ripe for gender harassment. And importantly, we should note the negative impact on health and well-being in these systems. Just to give you a sense of just how pervasive things are when we are in this type of culture and how it relates to gender bias and having far-reaching implications. Something as simple as thinking about who we perceive as competent. So it's very clear, it has been shown in the literature, that gender bias sways how we perceive competence, so the more masculine may be perceived as more competent. So now I'd like to move to applying an intersectional lens, which is important because interlocking categories of race and gender, for example, expose women of color to both racism and sexism. So let's understand a little bit more by what do we mean by an intersectional lens. An intersectional lens can be used both for a theoretical framework and an analytical tool. And it provides a multidimensional lens to examine women's experiences that gives visibility to multiple interlocking social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. So think about it, this intersectional lens actually gives us an opportunity to shine a light on what otherwise might remain invisible. So as a woman of color, for example, if we're focusing on gender and not race, we're not seeing the experiences of what happens when you have gender and race interlocking. We also need to understand how social identities influence participation and success in ways that can't be captured by examining or intervening on one identity alone, or sequentially rather than simultaneously. So I mentioned looking at the intersection of race and gender. So if you are dealing with the issues of both sexism and racism, it can manifest itself in many ways, including this additional emotional tax, stunted career growth, and the issues of isolation related to marginalization and exclusion that's related to stereotypes and bias and structural impediments. This type of environment and exposure to both sexism and racism really does contribute to our having untapped and uniquely positioned talent, and this persistent underrepresentation that we know is important or makes a difference in our ability to do the best that we can do in a scientific culture. We need to understand that there's structural racism that's built on institutionalized biases and barriers, and we also need to understand how the intersectional lens, as I mentioned, can shine a light on what to do as we move forward. So let's talk a bit about change. It's important to think about how we can have cultural shifts. Cultural shifts are always going to be extremely difficult because we need to change behaviors. We need to change mindsets. So we need to think about moving from this deficit-minded approach where we look at the women or people from underrepresented groups as having a deficit to seeing that as the assets that they bring, the assets that differences bring. We also need to think about an equity mindset and realize, importantly, that inequalities in status, recognition, and resources to and access to resources makes a difference on how one experiences a scientific culture. We need to look at how exclusion and bias needs to be addressed if you're going to have an inclusive environment that's devoid of bias. And we also need to think about things like collaboration. I mentioned earlier that science is completely social. It's built on relationships, personal dynamics. We know that to collaborate, we need to be able to take advantage of relational networks. We also know that women and those from underrepresented groups are less likely to have deep and effective networks from which to draw for collaborative science. And we should think about empowerment, empowering the individuals, empowering those who are in the environment. And what do we mean by empowerment? Empowerment takes many forms, but being in positions of leadership, positional authority, having some sense of control over your own area does make a difference. And we know for a fact that it's much easier to see yourself as a scientist or an engineer if there are others who look like you, and they're role models that you can aspire to. So I want to end with a couple additional things to think about. And one is that if we look at the underlying frameworks for this difficult change that we're talking about, these cultural shifts that I mentioned, here's some frameworks that could help undergird how we view those and how we make progress in that area. Negotiation of identity. And this negotiation of the identity, of course, is against a backdrop of structural injustice. So when we think about identities, we have multiple identities. Identities are constructed over time. They are influenced by the environments that we find ourselves in. They're influenced by social interactions. And if we don't have I guess I want to make the point, it's not just how we see ourselves, but how others see us as well. So negotiating those identities in the environment that I just mentioned needs to be addressed. I think we need to address and make a link between agency and structure, so what we do at the individual level and what we do collectively. I would also like to point out it would be helpful if we bring in the perspective of humanistic psychology. So just think about a humanistic approach. And if we think about the whole individual, everything they bring to the table, their entire set of identities, we cannot conduct science in a meaningful way if we ask individuals to leave part of their identities at the door in order to be a scientist or an engineer. And for a mechanism of change, I would posit that one thing that we should think about is that the individuals who are most affected, a way to have them at the center of how we're moving forward and use the individuals most effective as agents of change. You heard in the earlier talk, there was reference to like being more patient-centered, for example, and so that if you have the people who are effective, having the advocacy and the power to have some say in how you are affecting the change, it really would make much more of a difference. And I want to give you a sense of what form that could take, and refer to that as agentic activism. So several things that could happen with women and women of color and people who are marginalized at the center. What should these strategies look like? Creating counter spaces that are safe to have conversations, counter narratives. We need to correct the dialogues that are not accurate. We need to create community and empower those who are involved in leverage networks. And we importantly need to eviscerate myths. One of the biggest myths that we have to deal with in the science culture is that of meritocracy. This belief that merit alone will account for any differential experiences that people are having based on race, ethnicity, or whatever other identity. That's a great example of a myth that needs to be eviscerated. We need to think about what can we do locally for the solutions, the analysis of those solutions, and how we monitor them to see what progress that we're having, but then to combine that with national approaches, which includes things like how are we addressing policy. We need to create organizational catalysts, and we need to move from the rhetoric. We know what's wrong. We talk about it a lot. We need to move from that rhetoric to action. And that's what I'd like to leave you with today. You've heard throughout the course of this meeting is that we need to work together across disciplines. We need to integrate science, technology, and policy. We need to work in a way that we acknowledge the social constructs and the social factors, the organizational factors, in a way that we make a difference. So lastly, I'm saying that's our call to action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll now welcome our final speaker, Kate. Kate's going to be talking about working with the next generation of science and policy leaders.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks to the organizers for having me here today to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to me. I wanted to gauge the audience a little bit. So how many undergrad and grad students do we have in the audience today? That's pretty good. Postdocs? How about people within 5 years of their last degree? All right, we got a lot of folks in the audience that I think can resonate with what's been said today and hopefully chime into the discussion about what we're about to talk about for the next generation. So I was asked to address 2 questions in my remarks today. First, what changes to research culture do graduate students and postdocs want to see? And secondly, what role can the next generation play to move that culture forward? So what does the next generation of researchers want? Where do I begin? There's a lot to say here. We've covered a lot of topics here already that I feel very much resonate with the next generation as well. And I alone cannot possibly be the spokesperson for an entire generation, obviously. But to address this first question, this first question, we need to ask students themselves. When I was a AAAS fellow at the NSF Division of Graduate Education Division, I created the Innovation in Graduate Education Challenge to do just that. We asked STEM graduate students what they would change about graduate education and research. It was true then, and I think it's still true today, that opportunities for grad students to share their ideas about graduate education and research culture more broadly are few and far between. So I would like to draw upon what we learned from that challenge to start to get at the question of what changes the next generation wants to see from the research enterprise. So we received 525 entries from STEM graduate students all around the country in response to this challenge. We read each and every one of those entries and categorized them based on the problem statement they proposed. I should say up front that this was not a rigorous survey. This was an open-ended idea challenge, which we mined for common themes to get a sense for what the STEM graduate student community was thinking. Through our content analysis, we uncovered 4 key themes among the student entries, the largest of which was transferable professional skills. These comprised over half of all the entries. They talked about a lack of skills development needed to succeed in any future career, within or outside of academia. That includes communication, leadership, project management, et cetera, a whole list of skills. Next was program structure. That was the second most cited theme, with about 1/3 of the entries. These included entries that focused on the policies and practices governing graduate programs. And many of the student entries under this theme focused on the nature and quality of faculty mentoring and advising. The domain competency theme, or the training needed to be successful as students and researchers, including interdisciplinary skills and statistical analysis, was cited by a little under 1/3 of the entries. And the last theme, funding and resources, encompassed access to both financial and human resources, like research funding, professional networks, and career information. That was cited in about 1/4 of the entries. So if we dive into these 4 themes that we uncovered and look at the specific issues that fall under each of these categories, 3 of them rose to the top. First, the need for science communication, that biggish bubble under the blue theme. science communication training. Second was student-centered mentorship and advising. And I mean mentoring and advising from faculty, et cetera, that focus on the needs of the student. And third is preparation for non-academic careers. So as you see, there were a lot of other issues raised as well, but those are the top three in terms of numbers. I think this analysis is consistent with the findings of the recent National Academies report that Alan listed, and I had the honor of working on with Alan and the rest of the committee, including Keith and many others. And Alan already talked about this report, so I'm not going to spend time on that here, except to reiterate that the report was unusual in the fact that it included recommendations for students themselves. To me, this demonstrated the committee's respect for the agency of students to create change and to advocate for change where they could. I also think that in general, this analysis is consistent with concerns that are raised by groups like Future of Research and the National Postdoc Association and many others, particularly with respect to mentoring and non-academic career paths. Both of these organizations and others have done important work to advocate for changing research culture at the grassroots level. To address the second question I raised at the beginning, what is the role of the next generation of scientists in moving the research culture forward? I'm going to focus on just three areas among the many concerns that the next generation has with the current research culture: science communication skills, science policy exposure and engagement, and career exploration. So if I can grossly overgeneralize research culture, apologies for that, I would say it promotes a heads-down kind of focused approach on and it rewards research results above all else. That can mean that development of communication skills, engagement with policy or society more generally, in an intentional and ethical fashion, often falls by the wayside or it's not incentivized. It also means that non-academic and non-research careers are undervalued and in some cases stigmatized as second tier. Alan also mentioned this. I'm going to highlight two case studies in the remainder of my time, actually three case studies, but the first two are examples in which enterprising students and postdocs took the initiative to fill a gap in their training, or they created an opportunity where they didn't find one. Then I'm going to talk about an additional case study in which an institution was responsive to the needs of the next generation of researchers and stepped up to provide resources for them in a way that empowered students and postdocs to create better futures for themselves. What these three case studies share in common is that all three, I think, can be described as student-centered or next-gen centered. So the first example is about science communication skills. Around the year 2010, a group of astronomy and biology graduate students at the University of Washington went looking for communications courses that were designed for scientists. They looked everywhere through the curriculum on campus and they couldn't find one, so they created their own. Engage is the science speaker series and seminar, and they use techniques like storytelling and improv activities to teach communication skills that are then incorporated into engaging science presentations that students hone and present to a public audience in collaboration with a local nonprofit organization. Their program was incredibly popular, and the demand and kept increasing even as they continued into their second year. Eventually, the university noticed all the buzz and interest from the students, and they have since institutionalized Engage as a university course in the College of Environment. So the students not only filled an important gap in their training through this student-created initiative, they motivated institutional change, and that's lasted through today. The next example is exposure to science policy and science policy engagement. In the mid-2000s, student-created science policy groups began popping up at universities across the country as more graduate students saw the need for engagement with and access to science policy. The University of Washington's Forum on Science, Ethics, and Policy and MIT's Science Policy Initiative were among the first, I believe. And if anyone else knows of early ones, I'd love to hear about them. And there have been many dozens more created since that time. For the most part, these student efforts have been disconnected, each one starting from scratch. The founders of the National Science Policy Network saw a need to connect those disparate groups across the country and find synergy across them and support their emerging efforts. Established just last summer by STEM grad students and postdocs, the National Science Policy Network is a network of science policy, advocacy, and diplomacy groups distributed across the US, focused on providing a stepping stone platform that provides resources, networking, and training to groups worldwide. Two of the executive directors of the National Science Policy Network, Avital Percher and Michaela Ricard, are at this forum. Raise your hands. Maybe Avital's in the other room. So please reach out to them if you want to get involved, either as an early career researcher or as someone who wants to support their effort, volunteer as a mentor or fund their programs. Hint, hint to the foundations in the room. In the very short time since the National Science Policy Network began, they've managed to grow to a network of about 50 groups. They've run 2 microgrant competitions to support student projects at their member organizations, and a national policy memo writing competition in collaboration with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And they've held an annual symposium to convene budding science policy enthusiasts from around the country. By all measures, they've been extremely successful in a short time and provided a highly demanded and important service to emerging science policy leaders nationally. So the third and last example I'd like to share today is fundamentally different than the first two. It's not student created, and instead it's a top-down effort, but it does empower students. The UCSF program Motivating Informed Decisions, or MIND, is one of the NIH-funded Broadening Experiences in Scientific Training, or BEST programs. And Keith Yamamoto, right up front here, is one of the leaders of MIND. The goal of the MIND program is to teach graduate students and postdocs how to explore careers effectively and early in their training. They do this with a skills development course followed by career exploration with peer teams. The peer teams are groups of grad students or postdocs with trained facilitators who meet regularly with free food, of course, to help each other define and meet personal career exploration goals. Peer mentors provide encouragement, they hold each other accountable to their commitments, and they learn from each other's experiences and are more scalable than career counselors alone. The MIND team wrote a manual on their approach to peer career mentoring that's available to anyone. It's cited here. It seems to me that this is a model that can be implemented at many other institutions, and they've provided the resources to make that as easy as possible, so check that out. Peer mentoring teams for career exploration was not created by students, but rather it was created by the institution in response to the needs of their students and postdocs. But it is student and postdoc centered, and it empowers them to take charge of their own professional futures. Oftentimes, it's the upcoming generation that pushes for change to the status quo. I think we saw that with an example this morning about climate change. Pressure from the next generation is critical to motivating institutional change. But I want to be clear, the burden to change the research culture should not fall on grad students and postdocs. The power dynamics between students and faculty are real and consequential. Institutions should be supporting emerging researchers in their efforts to create these changes and advocate for these changes, giving them a seat at the table. I think we're seeing more and more programs putting effort into improving graduate education and research culture generally, even if progress is frustratingly slow and incentives are not well aligned for this kind of evolution. But the thing I want to leave you with is that students can be powerful change agents, especially when supported by their institutions and advisors. I hope that's evident from the examples I presented today and many more that I didn't have time to cover. The creativity and ingenuity of hundreds of thousands of emerging STEM researchers across America represents an extraordinary resource for positive change in the research culture and in society more broadly. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, everyone. Now, I'm going to start with a question, but what I really want to do is hear from all of you. So this is a good time to line up at the mic. Those of you in the overflow room, yeah, you. This is your moment. This is also a great time to come on in and ask a question. We also want to hear from you. I'm going to start by asking all of our panelists What do you see as the biggest hurdle to changing the education and research culture, but as well as the biggest opportunity right now? And let's go down the line, starting with Kate.
So I think the biggest hurdle has been mentioned a couple times today, but it's the incentive structure that's set up in academic research. It's the priorities that we've set, and since nobody has enough time, you have to spend your time on the priorities. If the priorities say research is king and training and education are second, then that's what's going to keep happening. In terms of an opportunity, I think students and postdocs can be, as I've already said in my talk, can be a great advocates for change, and I continue to see that happening. Another opportunity I would say is kind of the peer pressure among universities. If they can, when they are creating these great programs that are changing the research culture, that are supporting grad students and postdocs, they should be shouting it from the rooftop. This type of peer pressure should be giving them a competitive advantage. We should be saying we all want to reach these goals and do better, and so that would be my opportunity.
So I see the biggest challenge is wrapping our heads around and getting a mindset and a will towards actually doing something. Because even if we rationally said, okay, these are the things that need to be done, but it's just the will to do it. And translating that intent into action, I see as the biggest problem. In terms of an opportunity, this idea that we could give voice to those who have not had voice, and that we can come together in a way to make collective voices stronger. And I really want to make a particular endorsement for a recommendation that came from Dr. Husband's talk earlier, where she talked about us coming together around science, engineers, policymakers, and specifically the suggestion that we'd have collaboratories and makerspaces. It's something real that could actually bring some intent to action.
So I'm going to build off Gilda in terms of, I think the mindset is the most challenging part here. We actually had a session last fall at a meeting in which 3 of the committee members talked about busting myths around sexual harassment. And so one of the messages from the report is to change this mindset around the iceberg, that what's below the waterline somehow doesn't matter. It really does. And I think the opportunity there is that if we change the mindset, then what we end up doing is starting to think about sexual harassment as a public health problem, because it is affecting the whole field. It's affecting the bystanders, people in labs, not just the people involved in the harassment directly. And if we treat something like this as a public health problem, then we go in and we don't just wait until someone is sick. We go in and we try to figure out what the risk factors are for it spreading, and we try to counter that, and we try to inoculate people from getting it. So that is sort of my message on the opportunity here, is to shift the mindset from waiting and reacting to actually starting to work to prevent.
Did I make it work? I'm technologically challenged. I think one of the biggest barriers, I love what you just said, one of the biggest barriers is that the system works so well for so many people and so many vested interests. And so it works very well for the old white guys. It's very successful. It works very well for the funding agencies because they get more money based on how much productivity there is. And it works very well for most of the faculty because they learn how to work their way through it. What it doesn't work so well for are the various groups who are affected. I actually, doing the study, I had an odd, obvious insight, which was we need to listen to the affected people. And we're really lousy at that. And I confess I have been lousy at it at times as well. And that is, they not only know the problems far better than the leadership knows it, but they actually have thought about what would make it all better. And one of the advantages we had as a committee was having this cadre of younger people who actually have more recently experienced it. And it was very interesting, and I won't harp on it too long, but it was very interesting to watch the more senior people be influenced by the perspective of the younger people. Listening is a good thing.
Yes, your question. My name is Katie Valletta. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. My question centers around the individual role. So we talked a lot about the culture and how the culture needs to shift, but I believe that the culture cannot shift unless individuals take personal responsibility for the implicit bias that they may have. So I'm curious on the panel's thoughts around that.
I can jump in. One of the things the committee emphasized was that, well, two things. One, when they spoke about the need for leadership, strong, diverse leadership taking on this challenge, they meant it in the sense of the broadest sense possible. They, not just the boards of directors at academic institutions and the presidents and the chancellors and the provosts, but thinking all the way down to the level of teaching assistants who set climates in their environment and peers who reinforce or set some expectations of behavior. So they spoke about the need for everyone at all of those levels to address their role in speaking out, intervening when something happens. They also spoke about the fact that this is going to take a community effort. It needs to involve all parts of the community to take on this challenge of addressing sexual harassment. So I would agree there's many aspects to this, and there have been student groups at various universities that have led efforts to make specific recommendations for their institution for how to implement these recommendations, and that's a wonderful thing to have.
I would add, I like this. I would add that I think it takes leadership and courage to move these things. First of all, leadership from the top, I sort of think is obvious. The courage part is we need more and louder grumbling from the people who are affected, frankly. And I'm thinking here about graduate students who frequently have been giving a lot of talks about this report. And when I meet with graduate students, they resonate with everything, pretty much. And I think if there's a way for them to safely, the reason I said leadership is that a safe environment to do it has to be created. But if they increase the volume of what's bothering them, but mostly what they need, and do it in a concrete, as non-confrontational way as possible, I think that this is in response to the question about individuals. This is something that individuals can, in fact, do.
I have to add to that. So context matters. It matters what stage of your career you're in. It matters what kind of environment you're in. It matters what type of institution, discipline. Context matters. As far as individuals taking responsibility, part of the issue is when we think about things at the individual versus organizational level, usually we're thinking about the individuals who are the ones affected, and it's like it's their problem. It's nice that the person who just asked the question is trying to shine the light on individuals who are just in the environment and what can you do. So you don't have to be a passive bystander, like what can individuals do. One of the issues that really needs to be addressed, that there are communities who speak and speak loudly, particularly if you're from an underrepresented group or a woman of color, for example. There's retaliation, or if you're a target for sexual harassment. Part of why we're having such problems is that the people who are most affected, in many cases, speak out. They get worn out by having to carry the burden. They get absolutely retaliated against. There is this idea that if you say something you're going to be punished, and you're not going to, we'll make it, you think it's hard now, we're going to make it even harder for you for bringing this up. So you have to put those factors in line as well. And so it's not as simple as how are we going to deal with it and who speaks out when. It's a shared responsibility at all levels, top down, grassroots, all of that. And the more we share the responsibility, I think the better off we'll be.
What I meant when I started, just by the way, was that an environment has to be created that enables the expression. You can't just have, obviously, just have expression, but leaders of institutions have an obligation to create an environment that says it's appropriate, not just safe. It's appropriate to talk about these issues.
Hi, my name is Erin Kennedy. I'm a graduate student at UMBC, about an hour north. My question was, how do graduate students stimulate the creation of the environments where we talk about intersectional problems, we talk about graduate overwork, and how do we maintain that environment? How do we make sure that mentors are being good mentors in every sense of the way, not just with a singular training program, but continually?
I can start there. I think one thing that helps is when students can group together and you can talk through these things, and then you have a stronger voice in numbers, and you also have safety in numbers in some ways. And I also, in terms of mentorship, one of the things we talked about in the graduate education report was having students seek out multiple mentors and not thinking that your advisor is the only person who can be your mentor. And in some ways, they're not the right person to be your mentor, depending on the relationship. And so creating kind of your own personal board of directors for your life, your own network of mentors personally for you, I think helps a lot in that respect.
Hello? Oh, Lord. Hi, I'm Callan Fry. I'm a graduate student from the Medical University of South Carolina. That actually ties into my question, which we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I was hoping maybe the panel could speak more to perhaps advice to students who are trying to navigate these power differentials in their institutions and with their mentors and with other faculty members when they're trying to help enact these positive changes and positive cultural shifts.
Repeat your question again. You're trying to, like, what can graduate students do?
Just advice for people who are trying to navigate the from the bottom up. Does that make sense? Because
You're specifically asking about navigation.
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
So there are a number of things that come to mind when you're thinking about navigation. So one is to the whole mentoring piece, but understanding that the mentors can come from different levels, and peer mentoring is really important, as well as self-mentoring. And there's more that we could do around better understanding the dynamics and informing ourselves and reaching out to whatever resources we have. There's a lot that's helpful around collective voice versus like just trying to do all the talking alone. There are things around developing professional development plans, and many institutions will have like a postdoc office, and if there isn't a postdoc office or a graduate student office, those who, and some of the programs that were just mentioned by Kate, many of them are sharing what they have found to be effective for navigation, and drawing on some of those things I think are particularly helpful. The other thing is to think about, as you're navigating, drawing on and being true to yourself, like knowing yourself what it is that you actually want out of a career, because oftentimes, particularly at the graduate level and beyond, many students are waiting for someone sometimes to direct them.
Yeah.
And for a career, you really need to have some self-direction and knowing what is it that drives you career-wise, like what's the big thing that you really like to do. So that kind of thing, I think, would help as well as far as navigation.
Of course. And this is a specific case, but when it comes to the power dynamic between a grad student and his or her advisor, and the question of do they support me if I don't go into academia and commit myself to that, I think there are definitely cases where the advisor does stigmatize it. They don't agree. They think you should just be going in academia, but there's actually a large fraction of those situations where the advisor doesn't necessarily think that, but the student thinks the advisor thinks that. So finding some clarification of whether or not your advisor truly is kind of one-minded as to where their grad students should end up, or if you're assuming that's what they think. And I think there's actually a large proportion of advisors who would say, oh no, I'm not pressuring you to go that way. That's just your assumption, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Heather Bloomhard. I work in federal relations at Vanderbilt University. And thank you all for outlining not only the background, but the recommendations for how to make the changes to improve the culture. And I keep coming back to this question of how, and the order of operations to how we actually make this happen. And understanding that we really do need to work at all levels, top down, bottom up, all of that. I'm curious, how do you think we approach the strategy for making the changes that need to get made without inadvertently making things worse in the short term? And thinking specifically on the question as the question relates to sexual harassment in the academy, where there's been some talk about agencies making changes to how federal funding is awarded based on the investigations and accusations and reports and things like that, but the way that might incentivize just not doing the investigation, not allowing the reporting. How do you come at that so that you're not accidentally making it worse?
I'll take this one. What the committee emphasized is that what is needed is a system-wide change. And so there are many institutions out there that have done one of these things creatively, innovatively, but maybe they've done two, but they haven't ever necessarily pieced it all together as a collective effort. And so we also need to shift our mindset away from, I'm just going to plug this one thing in and that's going to fix the problem. These changes to sort of the ways in which we hold people up in science as being the leaders and perhaps holding those leaders accountable for their behavior is one that is crucial. It's a piece of this. And I think the overarching recommendation from this committee was that all of these changes we're about to make or are beginning to make need to be evaluated. We make a lot of changes in higher education to things and never think about whether or not we should test them. We rigorously study the research outside of academia, right, but not necessarily ourselves. And so there are a laundry list of things that need to be evaluated and calls for federal agencies to actually invest funds in evaluating the interventions that academic institutions are putting into place. So that's what I would say, is that it's an approach of try something based on promising principles and the research and make sure that you're building in an evaluation so that we can iterate and flag the problematic side effects.
I just want to quickly add one more thing to what Fraser just said, because that was a great response. But there's like this ambient kind of normalized gender, sexist kind of behavior that doesn't get called out. So one thing that we could do in terms of a how and something actionable, when that stuff, it's pervasive, it's around us. If we would start calling it out when we see it, all of us, I think that's a how-to, something concrete that's within our reach.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kelechi Elanya from Yale School of Forestry, a graduate student. I want to thank you all for your presentations and very rich. My question is about the issue of mentoring and advising, and I think that is one of the highest priority areas in my own view that we need to really address. So I'm wondering if there is the possibility to create a kind of a structure for mentoring that we could share to institutions and let them have a standard where you can measure or you can kind of check whether people are doing it or not, and it can be evaluated by the mentee and the mentor, and in that way we may be able to begin to create an action plan for progress. So that's my question.
If I could jump in, there's an ongoing study at the National Academies, as always, that is looking at the science of effective mentoring. It's due out at the end of this year, and it is designed to not just produce one of these tomes of a report in paper form, but also to produce an online toolkit that will essentially provide the community with models of what effective mentoring looks like, and do what you're describing, provide as some sort of template to evaluate or measure what your institution is doing.
Great, thank you.
I was going to say that.
I was going to add, I hope I'm being accurate in this, but the National Science Foundation implemented mentoring requirements for postdocs, I believe, a few years ago. Yes. Yeah. So I think that was a great step in the right direction, but hopefully these guides about mentoring will move beyond the I checked the box, that I had a meeting with my postdoc or grad student last month and dive into the kind of the depth and richness of what mentoring is.
We have a few more minutes. One of the things that struck me is physical spaces and infrastructure plays a role in all of this. I mentioned maker spaces, for example, and I wanted to hear if any of you could comment more on that element.
Just note that the physical spaces, when it comes to sexual harassment, can need to be carefully considered, because they can be the spaces that make people more vulnerable. There's been a lot of attention in science about the dangers that people encounter in field research sites, and that is very real. But we also need to think, in the conversations I've had across campuses, it becomes clear that it's not just field sciences, but also medical students that go and practice at a hospital that's totally independent from their academic medical center. And they're now in an entirely different setting with new rules, and who has jurisdiction and who do they report to if something happens. The same occurs for engineers. How many of them go off and do co-op or internship experiences, or do Engineers Without Borders, which is also in essence a field research site. So we have to think beyond just the climate or the organizational culture in the bounds of the campus, and also think about where our students go, where they're being actually, it's part of their education, they're getting course credits or something of that sort.
So kind of in expanding on your question, Erin, is what can be done outside of the physical spaces and the buildings to connect people who care about changing the research culture. So there's a lot more opportunities online, finding these types of skills and training modules online that I think can be pretty promising. Yes.
Hi, Sam Goodman, USITC. Several of the responses to questions have involved things like speaking with a collective voice or safety in numbers. So I'm curious where you see the role of the push for increased unionization on certain campuses, how that impacts and how it intersects with solving some of these issues.
I actually don't have a lot of evidence to kind of share what I don't know a whole lot about this, I guess is what I should say, but I certainly think that that's a mechanism to make sure that voices are heard and people actually pay attention to what students care about. So
I can just say, I don't have an opinion on it necessarily, but that I've been at events recently in New York, the National Center for Collective Bargaining in Higher Education, or in academia, I can't remember the full name, but where there was an entire panel discussion around the issue of sexual harassment and the role of unions in this, and one of the presenters gave a history of this in which unions have not necessarily been advocating for the rights of victims, but have actually been in the position of protecting the perpetrator when the institution found them responsible. But that is shifting, and you can see some of it in the media attention these days. There are many union contracts that are being negotiated on campuses, and they're asking for things like support for targets, increased transparency, and accountability. And so I think we will increasingly see that unions may play a crucial part in spurring or pushing some of these changes through.
And just one quick addition. In places where they have been having the discussions around unionization, especially at the graduate student level, whether they actually reach that decision to, or vote to unionize or not, it turned out that the conversations to get to that point drew a lot of attention to areas that needed attention drawn to them that would not necessarily have happened if they had not had those conversations towards unionization.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tori Osinski. I'm a current graduate student in the Biomedical Sciences program at UVA. And I've been kind of reflecting on my experience as I've been listening to all of this. And as a first-generation PhD graduate student, I think one of the things that I was very unaware of was all this culture and this need for a shift when I came in. And that made me think, is there a need for change in the branding of our graduate programs, what faculty and other students teach, and like first-year graduate students when they come in, so that there's a shift in the expectations of what graduate school should be? Because I know when I came in, I kind of got the vibe like, you gotta just learn your technical skills and learn your science and then you'll be good. But I think there's so much more that goes into that, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on, is there research you found from the studies, or what your thoughts are on kind of that role in graduate school?
So our committee actually laid out what it thought an ideal graduate education would be. And you know, a lot of it is not totally novel, but much of it focuses around the idea of providing a set of core competencies and then a variety of other academic experiences, but also paying attention to issues of student life, what it's like, what the power relationships are, and the you know, relationships like that. So universities are, from my perspective, way too autonomous in the sense that every department, every faculty member gets to define what in fact they want from it. And perhaps if we had some more consistency or standardization, it would work better.
I would just say that I think it is important, especially when it comes to sexual harassment, that we're more explicit about what, for instance, the advisor-trainee relationship should and should not look like. And I've heard as I've gone around the country that there are examples of programs or departments that have created a guidance document that they give to their students that lays out what it should and shouldn't look like. For instance, it says you should expect to meet with your advisor X number of times each semester, and then it says, and it should not be in a bar. Unfortunately, we may actually need to say that. And part of what's valuable about actually saying and laying these things out clearly to everyone is that we then don't disadvantage, like you're, I think, speaking to, we don't disadvantage the people that are unfamiliar with the academic environment. It doesn't harm the people that are already familiar, so why not lay these expectations out? In the case of sexual harassment and these guidance documents, it also simultaneously puts on notice all the faculty members of what the expectations are.
I'm going to ask one last quick question, and on a happy happy note, you've all been at this for a while. What has made you the most optimistic about culture change? Alan?
So I see it happening. I do. Unfortunately, and oddly, it seems to be happening most rapidly in many of the top tier institutions who are paying attention to this, and many of the others who aspire to the higher tier, whatever that may be, are in fact really holding fast to some of the historic performance criteria that they believe made the top tier. And I think if we can find a way to give more visibility to some of the accomplishments and some of the progress that's been made, that will, like all leadership, provide leadership. But if, as you go around, you see that there are many people who are taking a great amount of responsibility. And so watching the change start to occur, AAU has a whole bunch of programs, not to pick on Keith, but UCSF has had a wide array of things, MIT, Harvard. What we need is, people at the other kinds of institutions to be empowered to do more.
I would say what makes me most optimistic is that some of these changes really are thinking outside of the box, and I'm starting to see some of those things. I'll just give you two examples, and these out-of-the-box solutions didn't come from our report. They were based on the concepts in our report, and then people ran with it, and that's what we need to have happen. So one is that at MIT recently they announced, one department specifically announced they were going to give 1 semester worth of independent funding to any graduate student that needed to change advisors for any reason. So it does not out them as having experienced sexual harassment, but it gives them that financial means with which, if that is the best thing for them in that moment, then they can change advisors. That's about diffusing that power differential. The other example comes, there may not be a lot of lawyers in the room, I don't know, but surprisingly for many people, it comes from the General Counsel's office at UC Davis, where they are piloting a program to address the issue of passive harasser, in which when someone is applying for a tenure track position, they are required to sign a waiver that gives UC Davis the permission to access the applicant's current institution's HR records about them. Because it comes out of General Counsel's office, there is a policy, there's a procedure in which the UC Davis notifies the applicant of what they found, gives them a chance to respond, and so forth and so on. But the bottom line is that if the applicant does not sign the waiver, the application does not move forward. These are the sorts of we need to just stop thinking the way we have about just waiting till something happens and then trying to investigate it in a very formal way that takes a while and then disciplining people. We need to think about the ways in which we change the system so it does not encourage and allow sexual harassment to thrive.
So I've been encouraged by the heightened level of attention being paid to these issues, and that the level of discourse has been raised. And it's not like, let's just talk about it quietly behind a closed door. The doors have been open, we're shining a light. And so the hope is that we take that momentum and actually do something as we're having this high level of discourse. But I think that's a good thing that we are shining a light.
Actually, mine was very similar. And the optimism is that I keep seeing all these different angles of people raising awareness about these issues. And it's hard, and it has been a long time, and there are a lot of barriers. But the fact that we keep seeing multiple organizations and people talking about this, I'm hoping that that's going to get us over the edge.
Let's thank our panelists one more time.